Well, hello again. Welcome to church this morning, or church online, the Savo, if you're watching. My name's McLaughlin, and I'm one of the ministers here at Earlwood Anglican. And I'd like to start with a story, if I may. It's about a sales rep, a customer service rep, and a vice president of a software company. And they're all three walking through the park on the way to lunch one day when they come across an ancient oil lamp. Well, they give it a rub and out pops a genie. The genie says, "Look, I only give 3 wishes, so 1 each." Well, the sales rep pipes straight in and says, "Look, me first. He says, "I wish that I was in the Bahamas driving a speedboat without a care in the world." And the genie goes, poof, and the guy's gone. And then the customer services rep said, me next. And then she says, "Look, I want to be in Hawaii on a beach. I want to be lying by the beach with my own personal masseuse, an unlimited supply of pina coladas, and the love of my life lying next to me." Poof, and she's gone. The genie then turns to the vice president and says, "And what do you want?" And he says, "I want those 2 back in the office after lunch, please." Now, the moral of that story is always let your boss have the first say, just in case. But the reason I tell that story today is because we are looking at the Apostle Paul's 3 greatest wishes when it comes to evangelism. Now, as you know, we've dedicated the month of September to outreach, in which we're looking at the kind of topics that it will be easy to invite our non-Christian friends and family along to. But to prepare for that month of evangelism, we're spending the next 3 weeks looking at the Bible's teaching on evangelism. And today, I want to ask if the Apostle Paul, the greatest missionary and evangelist who ever lived, who ever walked this earth, if he came across a genie in a lamp, what would he wish for? What would he wish for? Now, our passage today, Colossians 4, 2-6, doesn't give us Paul's top 3 wishes for everything in life, okay? It does, however, give us his top 3 wishes with regards to evangelism, to preaching the gospel. And what we find is that 2 of those 3 wishes are for prayer. See, Paul says before we can even think about talking to people about God, we first need to talk to God about people. And these 2 prayers are our first 2 points for today, as you can see, namely, pray that God may open a door, and pray that the message be proclaimed clearly. Our third point tells us why evangelism is so important, which I've titled, Make the Most of Every Opportunity. And the reason our prayer and our actions in evangelism are so important is that evangelism is a war for people's souls. And so I've got that soldier's helmet up there. See, whether we like it or not, as Christians, we are involved in a war for people's souls. John Piper says of this passage that this type of prayer is missing when the church has settled into the world and uses prayer as a domestic intercom rather than a wartime walkie-talkie. What I want us to be reminded of today is that Christians are in a war for people's souls. Yet our greatest plans of attack will be an abject failure without God's help. And so while we need to make the most of every opportunity that is afforded us, and we're going to see that today, it is necessary that we speak to God first. Right? Before we speak to people about God, we need to speak to God about people. And so let's prepare for our war for people's souls by looking at pray that God may open a door, pray that the message may be proclaimed clearly, and make the most of every opportunity. And our passage begins, Colossians 4 verse 2. Devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful. Now, this is a command, devote yourselves. It's a command here, but notice the command is not to pray. I want us to understand that. You see, Paul expects Christians to pray. To be a Christian is to be in a relationship with God. And like any relationship, you cannot relate unless you communicate. So if you're the kind of person who only prays when you need something, please understand that you are not in a relationship with God any more than you're in a relationship with your barista. Are you? Right? If you only go to your barista when you need coffee, it's not a relationship, is it? So Paul assumes a rich prayer life for Christians. What he's commanding here is something over and above that. He's commanding a devotion to prayer. Now, what does the devotion to prayer look like? Well, I read of a Scottish pastor this week by the name of Robert Murray McChain. Now, McChain pastored in a small Scottish parish called Dundee, the little parish of Dundee. Now, here's the thing about McChain. He knew Hebrew well enough to be able to actually speak it to European Jews. He had a passion for the Greek classics, and he kept his diary, get this, in Latin, probably to keep it secret. Needless to say, he was supremely talented. And he could have served in much bigger and more notable parishes than in Dundee. The reason he chose to remain in Dundee is because no other church could offer him more time for prayer than Dundee could. That's devotion to prayer. Right? It is making life decisions like career and hobbies and family based around prayer, rather than fitting prayer in around family and hobbies and career. And that's what Paul is commanding here. Be devoted to prayer. Well, he then tells us what we're to pray for. Verse 3, and pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Now, the phrase open a door comes up 3 other times in the New Testament, a total of 4 times. So it comes up in Acts 14:27 regarding Paul's first missionary journey. It comes up then in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and of course here in Colossians. And this notion of God opening a door for gospel ministry naturally infers that when it comes to gospel ministry, when it comes to preaching the gospel, the door is usually closed. And this makes sense of our experience, doesn't it? See, the reason the road into the kingdom is so narrow, so few people take it, is because the default position for humans, or the factory setting that we all come with from birth, is a heart that is closed to the gospel. You see, what every human needs in order to become a disciple of Jesus is for God to open the door of their heart. Jesus himself says this. This is John 6:44. All right? Listen to this. No one comes to me. No one comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. It's right there in the scriptures. Right? The only way for a person to become a disciple of Jesus Christ is if God draws them, if God opens the door of their heart to the gospel. And what this means is that you and I should not be crushed if we don't see people converting to Jesus. We should not be crushed if we don't see the church growing. Now, we can be upset about that, okay? We can be even more upset if a church is not doing evangelism. That's our job. But if a church is doing evangelism, then it's doing its job. All right? Simply demanding more converts from our evangelism is like demanding that a man get pregnant. It's not their job. Right? Paul says God has to open a door for the message. But what this means is, if we're to engage in evangelism at this church, the first thing we have to do is pray. Pray that God will open a door for our message, right? We could letterbox drop thousands of houses. We could invite hundreds of people to church. We could get dozens of people coming along to church, or watching us online, as we're going to have to do this week as well, this month as well. But these efforts are absolutely fruitless unless God may open a door for our message. Brothers and sisters, We are in a war for people's souls. So will you pray with me across August like you've never prayed before, for God to open a door for our message across September? Because if we want to see the kind of revival numbers pouring into the kingdom that the early church saw, then we need to pray like the early church prayed. Pray that God may open a door for our message. But that's not the only thing Paul is asking for prayer over. Verse 4, pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. It being the message. Pray that I may proclaim the message clearly. Now note that Paul is not asking for the Colossians to proclaim the message here. It's curious, isn't it? Why is that? Well, as Dick Lucas points out in his commentary on this passage, not everyone has the gift of preaching, of proclaiming. In 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12, the Apostle Paul makes it very clear that God bestows different gifts on different Christians. So this is Colossians 12 verses 29 and 30. He says, are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers, do all work miracles, do all have gifts of healing, do all speak in tongues, do all interpret? Now the way those questions are phrased in the Greek expects the answer is no. Not everyone has the same gifts. And so the reason Paul doesn't pray for the Colossians to proclaim the message is because there may only have been one or two preachers in Colossae. However, this is not to say that Christians don't need to evangelise. Please don't hear me wrongly here. Right? Verses 5 and 6 that we're going to come to in a few moments make it very clear that all Christians, all right, need to be talking to people about Jesus. My point here, though, is that not all Christians have the gift of preaching or proclaiming. See, what Paul is asking for is prayer for himself as the preacher to be able to proclaim the message clearly. And let's face it, if you're going to invite someone along to church, or if you're going to invite someone to watch our online services together, you're going to want it to be a clear and helpful message, aren't you? Rather than a boring or cringeworthy one. So, pray that I, Brandon, or James, or Andy will be proclaiming that message clearly. I mean, let's face it, if the greatest missionary and evangelist to ever walk the earth says that the power of his sermons is in the prayer of his church, how much more do the preachers at Owen Anglican need your prayers? Now, I don't know when the last time was you ever prayed for the preacher. Might have been during a really boring sermon. You know, you're thinking, oh, Brendan is off his game today, Lord, please help him. All right? But it's too late by then, because the sermon's already written. But oh, the sermons that could be preached here of a Sunday if our church were praying for the preacher of a Wednesday. Brothers and sisters, we are in a war for people's souls. So will you pray with me across August, like you've never prayed before, that the messages we proclaim across September will be clear by anyone who preaches? Because if we want to see the kind of revival numbers responding to the message like the early church saw, then we need to pray like the early church prayed. Pray that the message may be proclaimed clearly. So, in the war for people's souls, 2 out of 3 of Paul's wishes are for prayer. And here's the thing, if we are praying these prayers, we should expect that God will answer them. And that brings us to Paul's third wish, which is in verses 5 and 6. Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. All right? So if we are praying for God to open doors, and if we are praying that the message be proclaimed clearly, then we should expect that God will place evangelism opportunities in our lap. And Paul expects us to make the most of those opportunities with 2 different things, all right? In 2 ways. The first is to be a good Christian witness 24/7. And by that, I don't mean 24 hours a week, 7 months of the year. All right? I mean from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep at night, our entire life is to be an ad for Jesus. Everything we do. Right? Be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt. The reason being, non-Christians are always watching us. They're trying to figure out, is this legit or not? And if it's not, then I have an excuse to ignore it. I used to work for a guy who was a strong Christian. He was a pleasure to work for. He would actually often run interference for me or others when, questionable requests came down from above. He was a lovely guy, but he swore like a sailor. And a colleague of ours once confessed to me that he was shocked when he found out this guy was a Christian. Friends, don't be that person. Don't be the person that people are shocked to find out is a Christian. Rather, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders. Let your conversation be always full of grace, and seasoned with salt. That's our first job. Our second job is to be ready to tell them why we're a Christian. Be ready to preach the gospel to them. What does it say? Make the most of every opportunity so that you may know how to answer everyone. While Christians are not all called to be preachers, we are all called to teach people about God, to answer their questions about Jesus, and to explain to them the gospel. Now, this does not mean, please understand, this does not mean that you have to have all the answers yourself. All right, I once knew a Christian uni student in Melbourne years and years ago, and he had an atheist classmate who was he knew he was a Christian, a good Christian, but he was always peppering him with these really curly questions. What he wanted was to show that this Christian was an idiot for being a Christian, and so he would ask all these hard questions. Well, this Christian did not have the answers. So what he did was he got his friend to record his question, and then he took the question to his minister and then recorded the minister's answer and then took it back to his friend. Now, after toing and froing for a couple of weeks, the guy said, "Look, you've just got to come and meet the minister," which he did. And that guy went on to become a Christian and then a Christian minister. Brothers and sisters, we are in a war for people's souls. So as you are praying across August like you've never prayed before, will you also make the most of every opportunity God places in our laps in answer to those prayers? Now, I'm not saying this is going to be easy. Praying for God to open a door takes time and therefore perseverance. Jonathan Edwards prayed for 7 years straight before God brought a revival to his town. Praying that the message be proclaimed clearly takes discipline. It will mean having to add a new thing to your prayer diary on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. Pray for the preacher this week. And making the most of every opportunity that God places in your lap. That's scary. It means being an ad for Jesus with our whole lives and a source of knowledge for Jesus with our words. We have to remember, these are not peacetime requests. They are wartime orders. And the reason wartime orders are so necessary is because they help save lives. In the first month of his prime ministership of England, Winston Churchill had to oversee Operation Dynamo. That's where 300,000 British troops were rescued from Dunkirk on continental Europe. The German army was about to overrun the British army at Dunkirk. And so Churchill had to make the very unenviable decision to order the 30th Infantry Brigade, stationed a little south at Calais, to lead a rearguard attack on the German front line, knowing that those soldiers would probably be overrun. But the plan was to distract the Germans long enough for the army at Dunkirk to be evacuated. During the 4-day siege of Calais, 300 British soldiers were killed, 200 were wounded, and when they were finally overrun, 3,500 were taken prisoner. Many never returned to England. Yet the plan worked, and all 300,000 soldiers at Dunkirk were rescued. Those soldiers went on to make up the bulk of the invasion force a few years later that finally defeated Hitler. Now, brothers and sisters, this is what God is giving us in this passage. A wartime order to save people's souls. Now, as Christians, we know we've already been rescued. And our rescue came from God the Father making the unenviable decision to command his Son to take a rearguard attack on our enemy, sin. And as we know, Jesus was overrun in that attack. Yet that plan worked. And anyone who repents of their sin and lives with Jesus as their captain is now rescued from our enemy. Yet like the soldiers at Dunkirk, our war is not over yet. See, every single person you and I meet will have to stand before their Maker one day. And if they haven't repented and put their faith in Jesus, then they will be overrun. Right? Our orders are to play our part in the rescue of these souls. So, brothers and sisters, what this passage reminds us is that outreach is war. People's souls are at stake. And as God's soldiers, we have in this passage the top 3 priorities for our war. So friends, will you pray with me this month that God may open a door for our message? Will you pray with me this month that the message will be proclaimed clearly? And will you make the most of every opportunity afforded us? For it's not just the Apostle Paul that wants these 3 things. It's our captain who was overrun, rescuing us. May we be faithful soldiers this month and beyond as we follow our wartime command and save everyone we can.